Hello my dear students, this is Roshni from LearnoHub, the free learning platform, and I welcome you to today's session, which is the fourth video lecture of the video series on how do organisms reproduce, class 10th science. And in this video we will talk about the need for sexual reproduction. In the previous two videos we have been talking about asexual reproduction. So now let's take a look, why do we even need sexual reproduction? After that, we will also start studying about the sexual reproduction in plants. Now, this is going to be very, very important, children. So, stay focused. Are we all ready? Let's get started. Now, let us quickly see what is sexual reproduction. It is the mode of reproduction in which new individuals are formed from two parents. So here we need two parents. From single parent, it cannot form. So whenever I talk of two parents, I also mean that there has to be sex differentiation. There has to be one male, there has to be one female. Right? So here sex is involved. When I say sex, sex is nothing but mating between the two parents. The two parents must fuse with each other, they must meet with each other so that the new organism is formed. So here fusion between the male and female gametes give rise to the new organism. So gamete is nothing but the specialized sex cells. So here new individuals are not exactly identical to the parents. However, they have some similarities to their parents. At the same time, they also have certain new characters which were not present in their parents. For example, in this picture, you can see the color of the eyes of the kids. So, the mother has brown eye, the father has black eye, but this kid has got blue eyes. So, blue eyes are not present in either of the parents, but the kid has it. So, there are some characters which are completely new in the new individuals. Variations occur, so these new characters are nothing but variations, that is differences. And these variations have got a very significant role to play in the long run. So now we will talk about why do we need this mode of reproduction. When we already had asexual mode of reproduction, what was the need of having sexual mode of reproduction? Why can't all the organisms, all the living organisms on earth reproduce asexually? Why do they need another mode of reproduction? So let us discuss that. When we know that this sexual mode of reproduction is a relatively slower process, because you saw in asexual reproduction how many new organisms were formed. For example, in multiple fission, so many organisms were formed just in one shot. Similarly, in case of fragmentation or regeneration, you saw that when an organism was broken into pieces, each piece gave rise to a new organism. So multiple organisms were being formed at one go. But in case of sexual reproduction, we will see that it is a very gradual process, and also at a time you do not get plenty of organisms, right? So that is also, in both the sense, sexual reproduction is a relatively slower process than asexual reproduction as far as multiplication rate is concerned. Now the question is, why sexual reproduction? When we know that we already had a primitive mode of reproduction, that is asexual mode, then what was the need of having sexual reproduction? Because the purpose of reproduction is anyways to produce new organisms. So we were able to do that with asexual mode. So why is it that not all living organisms reproduce asexually? Why was this sexual reproduction brought into picture? So let us look at some of the reasons where sexual reproduction has certain advantages which were not present in the asexual mode. First of all, to incorporate variations in species, which in turn ensures survival of a species. So this term, variation, this was possible only with sexual reproduction. Because in asexual reproduction, the daughter organisms or the new organisms which were produced, that were exactly genetically identical to their parents. So there was no new character being seen in the new organism. There was no difference in the traits of the new organism. So there was no scope of variation in case of asexual reproduction. So one thing is variation was there in sexual reproduction. Now the question is, why is variation so important? So in one of our previous slides, I already told you the significance of variation, right? That variation actually ensures the survival of a species. The example which I discussed in that slide, like we have so many different varieties of dogs today. We have Alsatian, we have so many different types of dogs, right? Now, if suddenly some climatic changes happen, let us suppose if the weather becomes too cold. So since now we have so many varieties, at least the varieties with fur will be able to survive. Right? So because of the variation, so these small traits have come into picture due to variation. So variation in the long run helps in survival of a species. Variation also helps in the evolution of new species. That means variation over a period of time. Small variations, when gets accumulated over a period of time, it altogether gives rise to a new kind of organism. Right? So these are some of the importance of variation, because of which it is so important. The next was, each individual in a species has its own uniqueness and identity. Okay. So in case of asexual reproduction, all the organisms were exactly same. So you cannot differentiate between, let us take an example of anything which reproduces asexually. Let us suppose Hydra. So if Hydra reproduces asexually, you will not be able to distinguish between the parent Hydra and the daughter Hydra, because they are going to be exactly same. So, but in case of sexual reproduction, each individual in a species, even though the species is same, for example, let us consider human beings. In human beings, all of them have 2 eyes, 1 nose, 2 ears. So everything, that way is the basic structure is the same. Still, each one of us looks so very different, right? So except for the twins who are exactly identical. Other than that, if you see human beings, even though their basic structure is the same, they all belong to the same species, but still they look different. That means each of them has some uniqueness of their own. They have an identity of their own. It is just that they have some similarities of their parents, but they are not exactly identical. So this uniqueness, the word uniqueness, is possible only with sexual reproduction. So each person is unique in himself or herself, right? So these were some of the things because of which sexual reproduction came into picture. Now, when I talk of sexual reproduction, DNA becomes one of the most important concept behind sexual reproduction. As I mentioned before also, like before anything gets constructed, whether it is a car or a building, there has to be a blueprint. Similarly, before a living organism actually is born, a blueprint of that living organism is also created, and that blueprint is nothing but DNA. So DNA copying mechanism is the key concept behind sexual reproduction. That is, the DNA of the parents gets copied, and that copy of DNA of the mother and the father then combine to form the DNA of the new organism. Now, if the DNA copying is exactly accurate, in that case, the daughter is going to be identical. But in the real time, the DNA copying is never accurate. It has certain inaccuracy. And because of those small inaccuracy, the new characters arise, or the small variations arise. So let us see now how DNA gets copied from 2 parents. So now let us try to get some rough idea about how DNA gets copied from 2 parents. Now, in one of the previous slides, I already told you where is DNA located in our body. So inside our body, which is composed of cells. Now inside each cell, we have a nucleus. So when we look at this nucleus more closely, it looks somewhat like this, where at the center we have a nucleolus, and these thread-like structures are chromosomes. So they are chromosomes. Now, the number of chromosomes in a species is fixed. For example, in human beings, there are 46 chromosomes. So 46 chromosomes exist inside each cell of our body. Now when we look at this chromosome even more closely, they look somewhat like this. So it looks as if there are two strands which are joined at between. So two strands which are joined here. So this structure which joins these two strands is known as centromere, because it joins them at the center, and each of these strands is known as chromatid. Now you also see some yellow colored structures here. So these structures are nothing but genes. Now again, when we look at these genes closely, so we see that they are made up of DNA. This is how the structure of DNA looks like. What is DNA? DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. Deoxyribonucleic acid. Now what is this DNA? What does it consist of? This DNA actually contains the information which is needed for protein synthesis. DNA actually tells what kind of proteins needs to be synthesized, right? So here the DNA is made up of two strands. This is one strand and this is another strand. So what is there here? What are these lines inside DNA? These are nothing but, these are a sequence of nucleotides. It is made up of nucleotides. Now what are all these things? Nucleotides, nucleic acid, they are all made up of proteins. If you have, when you go to your higher classes, maybe in class 12, you will have a lesson on biomolecules where you will study the relationship between these kind of molecules like the nucleic acids, amino acids, proteins, and where do you see them in biology. So then you will learn about more of these structures. So for now you can just understand that it consists of a sequence of nucleotides. Now this sequence actually decides what kind of protein needs to be synthesized, right? So what kind of protein will be made? For example, let us suppose that this is a DNA, okay? And let us suppose that the nucleotides which are present up till here, they all code for hormonal proteins. So they all together are making, or they are actually giving the instructions to make what kind of proteins? Hormonal proteins. So this segment of DNA which codes for one type of protein is known as gene. So we will call this segment of DNA as a gene. Similarly, let us suppose there is another segment of DNA which codes for structural proteins. So we say that this is another gene. Because see, when we talk of gene, there are many traits, there are many characters which are carried by gene. For example, as I gave you one example before also, that somebody has high blood pressure and he says that that problem is hereditary. It is getting transferred from one generation to the next. So that is one trait. So that is carried by a gene. Similarly, for example, here, if I say that the first set of DNA or the first segment of DNA, they all code for hormonal proteins. Now, what do hormonal proteins do? They will actually decide the growth and development of the body, because hormones actually control the growth and development of the body. There are growth hormones. We have studied all these things in the endocrine system, right? So when this part of the DNA controls the synthesis of hormonal proteins, so that means this part of DNA actually decides what kind of growth and development a person will have, whether the person will be tall or he will be short, he will be fat, he will be thin, right? Similarly, the next set decides that what kind of structural proteins will be made. So that means it will decide the structure of a human being, whether he will have what kind of features, whether he will have what kind of complexion. So all the structural things will be decided by this part of DNA. So now you can understand that DNA, what is DNA? It is just the basic part of a gene. Inside chromosomes we have gene, and the gene is made up of DNA. DNA is nothing but it is a sequence of nucleotides. So we will talk about the structure in detail in our next lesson, not now, because that will consume a lot of time here. So for now you just understand it is made up of a sequence of nucleotides. and that sequence decides what kind of proteins will be made. Now, as the type of proteins differ, the characteristics also differ. Right? Okay, so now when this DNA, now what happens in case of reproduction? In case of reproduction, each parent will make a copy of their DNA. Right? That is what happens in reproduction. So let us see what happens in case of a reproduction. Let us suppose if this is a family. So this couple gives birth to this kid. So what happens? Father has his DNA, mother has her DNA. Right? So both of them will create a copy of their DNA. Then these two DNA copies will combine to form the DNA of the daughter. Now, just before some time I told you that the number of chromosomes is fixed in human beings. It is 46 chromosomes. So now if I say that this father will make a copy of his DNA, mother will make a copy of her DNA, two DNAs will combine to form the DNA of the child. So does that mean that the child will have the double DNA? So the child will get both two DNAs. So two DNAs will combine to form double DNA. So the child will have double number of chromosomes. Because what is DNA? DNA will form the gene. Gene will make the chromosome. So when the number of DNA will increase, the number of chromosomes will also increase. Right? So does that mean that the daughter will have the double number of DNA? That is not possible, right? Because in every human being, the number of chromosomes remains fixed. That is, the number of chromosomes is always 46. So what happens there? What is the clue behind that? Now what happens is that in our body, there are certain specialized cells which have only half the number of chromosomes and half the amount of DNA as compared to other cells of the body. That means inside our body, we have so many different cells. The cells are specialized to perform different functions, right? But the basic structure of all the cells remain the same. So now in the human body, every cell contains 46 chromosomes, except some specialized cells. Those specialized cells will contain half the number of chromosomes. That means instead of 46 chromosomes, they will contain 23 chromosomes. So now when these specialized cells of the father and the mother will combine, then what will happen? 23 from mother, 23 plus father, so it will combine to form 46. So the total number of chromosomes in the child will be 46. Right? So that means this process of reproduction starts with those specialized cells. And what are those specialized cells? Those specialized cells have got different names. They are called germ cells. They are also known as sex cells. They are also known by the names gametes. So these are different names of those specialized cells. So these are the specialized cells in our body which have half the amount of DNA. Therefore, when they combine with the other specialized cell, the amount of DNA becomes same as that present in all other cells in the body. So is that clear? Now, I am sure that there are questions which have not been answered in this slide, like the exact structure of DNA, how exactly the DNA makes its copy. So that is known as DNA replication. So we will talk about all those things in detail when we deal with the next lesson on heredity and evolution. So for now, you got this idea about sex cells or gametes, right? Because now we are going to discuss about the exact process of reproduction. So there we will be using these terms gametes and germ cells very often. So let us see, what are gametes? These are the sex cells. Now these gametes in some organisms, the male and female gametes are identical to each other. Now when we are talking about sexual reproduction, we are definitely talking about two parents, right? So when there are two parents, that means there should be sex cells from both the parents. So from one parent, from the male parent, male sex cell should come. From the female parent, female sex cell should come. Now it is seen that in some organisms, the male gamete and the female gamete are exactly similar to each other. There is no difference at all. For example, let us suppose if this is the male cell, this is the female cell, right? So now when both of them are exactly identical, sometimes it becomes, then it cannot differentiate between who is male and who is female because both are same. So in that case, they are sometimes not referred as male and female. Instead of that, they are referred with the symbols plus and minus. So plus and minus denotes the two different parents because they do not have any dissimilarity, so that we can say that, okay, this one is male and this one is female. Both are same. So instead of referring them as male and female, they are often denoted as plus and minus. So here you can see, now there are many possibilities. Now in this case, both the male gamete and the female gamete can be motile. That means both of them can be capable of moving. It is also possible that both of them are non-motile. Both of them do not move from one point to another. Right? So these kind of organisms where the male and the female gametes are exactly identical to each other, that is often given a term called isogamy. Iso means same, gamy means gametes. So same gametes, that is isogamy. So examples of organisms where we see isogamy is Chlamydomonas, Spirogyra. So these are all examples of green algae which fall under the plantae kingdom. So they are simple multicellular organisms. So there we see these isogamy. But in most of the advanced organisms where sexual reproduction takes place, the male and female gametes are different from each other. So they have got different appearance, they have got different structure, they have different function. So they are quite different from each other. So we can easily distinguish them as male and female. The best example is human beings. In human beings, when I talk about the male gamete, it is motile. That is, the male gamete is capable of moving. The male sex cell, that is the cell which is present inside the body of human male. Similarly, when I talk about the female gamete, its main function is food storage. So in any woman, there is a sex cell which is capable of reproduction. So its main function is storage of food. So this is how the female and the male sex cell looks like. This is how the female sex cell looks like in human being, and this is how the male sex cell looks like. So this one, male gamete, is capable of moving, and the female gamete doesn't move, but it has the capability to store food. Now fusion of male and female gametes give rise to a new organism. So both of them fuse together to form a new organism. Right? So these two gametes contain half the amount of DNA. So when they combine, the amount of DNA becomes same as what is present in all other cells in the body. Clear? So the idea about gametes is also clear. Now that we have got the basic idea about sexual reproduction, what happens in sexual reproduction roughly. So now we will study how these gametes are produced in different organisms. That means how a male gamete is produced inside a human male, how a female gamete is produced inside a human female. So not only human beings, we will also talk about sexual reproduction in plants. That what is a male gamete in plant, what is a female gamete in plant, and how are they produced. So these are the topics which we are going to discuss in detail now. Sexual reproduction in plants. So we have already seen in some of the previous slides that plants do reproduce asexually. There are many different ways by which plants reproduce asexually. That is, naturally they do it by vegetative propagation with the help of their roots, stems as well as leaves. They are also made to reproduce artificially by different methods like cutting, layering and grafting. So here we will look at the sexual reproduction in plants. Now, when I talk about sexual reproduction, we need certain part of the flower which is specialized for reproduction. As I mentioned before also, it is not that any cell of the body can reproduce. There are certain specialized cells which have the capability to reproduce. So in plants, those specialized cells are present in which part of the flower? Which part of the plant? It is present in the flower. So we see that flower is the reproductive organ of a plant. So flower is the reproductive organ of a plant. So that means inside the flower we have the organ which produces the male gamete. Again, inside the flower we have the organ which produces the female gamete. So now the question is both the male organs and the female organs, they are present in the same flower or they are present in different flowers? Now again, based on that, a flower can be divided into two categories. A flower is said to be unisexual if either male or female reproductive part is present in it. The word uni itself means one. Uni means one. So unisexual means only one sex is present inside that flower. Either the male part is present or the female part is present. Now it is very obvious that if the male part is present, the male part will produce the male gamete. If the female part is present, so the female part will produce the female gamete. So both of them will not be present in the same flower. So that kind of flower is known as unisexual. Some of the examples of unisexual flowers are papaya and watermelon. So if you look at the papaya and watermelon, these are name of the fruits which we eat, right? Now if you look at a papaya plant, you will see that those plants actually have fruit is the result of that plant. But before the fruit, you get flowers like this. So these kind of flowers are seen in those trees. Now there are two types of flowers. One is a male flower, one is a female flower. So there are two different types of flower. So the male flower will contain only the male reproductive part. The female flower will contain only the female reproductive part. Right? So both of them will have different appearance. They do not look exactly the same. Similarly, if you look at the flowers of watermelon, here you can see. So see, these are the buds. They are yet to become flower. So if you look at this one, this is the male flower and this is the female flower. So the female flower has an additional swollen structure. Right? So what are these structures that we will discuss in the next slides. But for now, you just understand that there are some flowers which are, even though they are of the same plant, but they will carry either the male part or the female part. Both will not be present in the same flower. So such flowers are known as unisexual. On the other hand, a flower is said to be bisexual if both female and male reproductive parts are present in it. Then it is called bisexual. So examples of such plants would be China rose and mustard. China rose is something I think which is very common even in your houses. You can see that you have China rose plant in your house. So if you look at a China rose flower very closely, you will be able to see that it contains both the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part. That means in the same flower, the male gametes will be produced as well as the female gametes will be produced. So now before we try to understand how sexual reproduction takes place in plants, it is quite worthy to know what are the advantages of sexual reproduction over asexual mode in plants. Because in plants we have seen that plants reproduce asexually as well. So then now that plants can reproduce sexually also, so are there any advantages of sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction? Or are there any advantages of asexual reproduction over the sexual mode? So both of them has its own advantages and disadvantages. So let us have a quick look. When I talk about the asexual reproduction, let us look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction. The first thing is it is easier and faster mode of reproduction. Very obvious. That's because we saw that how in the different modes of asexual reproduction, so many organisms were formed just at one go. Seedless plants can also be grown by vegetative propagation. For example, rose, which do not give seeds. So in that case, if there is no seed, we cannot think of sexual reproduction, because in sexual reproduction, formation of seed is a part of sexual reproduction. So there are plants where there are no seeds. So in those plants, sexual reproduction cannot take place. So they can also be grown by asexual mode. Desired traits can be preserved through generations. What do we mean by desired traits? Because in asexual reproduction, we know that the new organism or the new plant which will be formed, that is going to be exactly identical to the parent. So whatever plants we desire to have, we can grow them asexually because we have the surety that the same plant will get formed. So the desired traits can be preserved through generations. New plants formed are genetically identical to the parents. So the new plant will be exactly the same as the old plant. Now, it has both advantage and disadvantage. The disadvantage is that it doesn't involve any variations. And the advantage is that if you want an exactly similar plant, you get it. Such plants are more prone to diseases. When I say more prone to diseases, why? Because if there is any disease or if there is any issue with the parent plant, since the same thing is getting replicated after asexual reproduction, so that means the chances of diseases in all the next generations is going to be very high because the same kind of plants will get produced, right? Now, on the other hand, when we talk about the sexual reproduction, so this sexual mode is a relatively slower mode of reproduction as far as the multiplication rate is concerned. But here genetic variations are seen which are extremely important in the long run. These are less prone to diseases because in this case there is a probability, that means the child will have some characteristic of the parent, of the father, some of the mother. So we are not very sure that if one of the parent is diseased, the child is definitely going to be diseased. There are chances that it can be, there are also chances that it cannot be. Right? So these are some of the pros and cons of both sexual as well as asexual reproduction in plants.
I hope you found this entire series on reproduction or how do organisms reproduce useful. If you have a feedback to share, do let us know in the comment section. If you really like the video, you should share it with your friends so that they can enjoy the video too. I will see you all very soon with a new video with a new topic. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.